Hello and welcome to Dialogue. The United States, the United Kingdom, Canada have joined the European Union to impose sanctions on Chinese individuals and entities over human rights allegations after the EU sanctioned China for the first time in over 30 years. And Beijing quickly responded to the EU's actions targeting individuals and organizations in the bloc. Are these coordinated sanctions on China by the West a sign of things to come? And how will this new development affect China-EU economic cooperation? And how will Europe position itself amid the ongoing tensions between China and the United States? To talk about all those issues, I'm joined here in the studio by Victor Gaojikai, Chair Professor of Suzhou University, and Pieter Cleppe, Editor-in-Chief of Brussels Report, and Zun Ahmed Khan, Research Fellow at the Belt and Road Strategy Institute at Tsinghua University. That is our topic. I'm Zhou Yue. So let me start with you, Pieter. The US, UK, now EU and Canada have imposed their sanctions on Chinese over its handling of the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. What are their justifications for doing that?
Well, they basically think that China is, of course, entitled to fight extremism and terrorism, but they are of the opinion that the Chinese approach is incredibly disproportional by locking up so many people, and they are also skeptical of the explanations given by China that this would be mere re-education. They cite examples of how, for example, doctors were also locked up, people that are perfectly integrated into society. So because of this, they have moved indeed to move with so-called Magnitsky-style sanctions, which are not traditional economic sanctions, but very targeted to very specific policymakers.
So Victor, they are doing this following the Magnitsky-style sanctions targeting individuals for human rights abuses. But in the Chinese perspective, it is the right thing to do?
No, absolutely not. I think, first of all, the accusations of serious crimes, for example, crimes against humanity and genocide in Xinjiang, are completely unfounded. They actually contradict with the situations on the ground, and they are not only untrue and fabrications, they are also insults to the Chinese nation of all the 56 nationalities, including our Uyghur brothers and sisters. And I think the reality in Xinjiang is that the population of Uyghurs has been increasing. It has more than doubled since 1950. And in recent years, the growth rate of the Uyghur population is more than other nationalities in Xinjiang and is much more than the national average in China as a whole. So come up with evidence. Where is the genocide? Where is the killing? Where is, for example, the disappearance leading to the deaths of the people? There is no such evidence. The so-called fabrications are viciously driven, and they should be condemned by anyone, anywhere in the world with decency.
What about what they call the locking up of Uyghurs in those vocational training centers, which is considered a major offense in their eyes?
Well, first of all, if we look at Xinjiang, bear in mind Xinjiang borders with Afghanistan, and there is a war in Afghanistan launched by the United States and NATO, which has lasted for 20 years. It has resulted in extremism and terrorism in Afghanistan being intensified, and the spillover of such evil forces from Afghanistan to Xinjiang is and should be understandable. Just imagine if California borders with Afghanistan. Do you think people in California will have sanity, will have easiness of sleep at night? If England or France or Germany borders with Afghanistan, do you think they will be immune to such terrorism and extremism? Xinjiang is on the forefront of this situation, and I would appeal that the United States and NATO member countries stop the war in Afghanistan as quickly as possible to restore peace and stability in that part of the world, rather than, for example, blaming China, which China is a victim of the terrorism and extremism in Xinjiang. we should really call a spade. We should be reasonable, and we should be realistic about the megatrend in Xinjiang, that is people of all nationalities, including the Uyghurs. We want to have peace, stability. We do not want to have any spillover of terrorism and extremism. And in Uyghurs' case, separatism. How can any Chinese people in China tolerate the prospect of the effort by anyone to split Xinjiang away from China? We should see the real nature of such allegations, and we should see what is driving these countries, including the United States and some of these EU parliamentarian members.
And Zun, I know you are from Pakistan, also a Muslim country plagued by terrorist threats. And probably some Western audiences don't understand that Xinjiang is also bothered by this problem. But put it into context. Do you think the response from the Chinese authorities is proportionate to the threat itself?
So, Mr. Zoya, I was listening to what, for example, Victor Gao is saying. I'll take it from there and try to contextualize the ground realities. You see, I would also go on to say that, of course, Afghanistan is a victim of interventionism. Interventionism has radicalized people, has resulted in the exaggeration and enhancement of the three evil forces, as we say in the SCO mandate as well. We want to eradicate separatism, extremism, and terrorism. So the first issue is obviously that where did this issue start? Where does it exacerbate? And we know that the kind of foreign policy, the kind of interventionism that has been pursued, not just by Washington, but also allies of Washington, their own people have also time and again tried to hold them accountable for their attitude and their policy towards countries like Iraq, Syria, Libya, and the list is endless, to be honest. Pakistan is also a victim of the unfortunate outcome of a war that has lasted 20 years, and that needs to end. So if I try to answer your question, what is the reality? What does radicalization feel like and look like? The truth is that it happens one step at a time. And there comes a moment when it's too late, when we all of a sudden lose too many lives and we realize that there could have been preemptive measures we could have taken. Now, there is no perfect way to address terrorism and extremism. There is no perfect way to identify who are those people who are impacted. But I'll give you a small example. For instance, in 2007, our government had an effort against a mosque, and for some time, people were not sure, should we go after this? Should we actually close a mosque because it is spewing radicalism? Well, it happened a bit too late, because if we had made efforts earlier, it could have been better. Then we had an unfortunate incident in 2014 where 157 children were massacred. Of course, I wish Pakistan was able to identify earlier and make sure that this doesn't happen. So there's no perfect solution. Pakistan has come a long way. Under the SCO, we have the RATS mechanism where Central Asian countries, Pakistan, China, Russia, together we are trying to address these issues. And de-radicalization, preemptive measures, effective, are a very good way. They're much better than going to war after calling people terrorists and then carpet bombing cities and villages with millions who have died. So it is a complex problem. People who have suffered from it, societies that have suffered from it, are constantly trying to find a better way to do it. And Xinjiang is an example. Look at the economy, look at the stability, look at the prosperity. Many countries in the region wish that we can achieve that level. So I'll stop there, but definitely it's important to contextualize what's happening.
So, Peter, probably some of the complaints from the Chinese is that the Western politicians, this time the Europeans, don't appreciate the fact that Xinjiang as a region has become better off because of the policies, and those vocational training centers are not what they thought as a concentration camp.
Well, so that's being disputed in the West, but I want to come back to the intervention in Afghanistan. I think many people in the West actually agree that this was a big mistake. I mean, Afghanistan is also the graveyard of empires. The British have suffered defeat there, the Soviets, and I don't think you can call this intervention a great success, to put it mildly. Many people are asking for the US to indeed pull out, or at least only keep a base there and then not really mingle anymore with the domestic situation, which was probably a wise thing to do. Now, I think what China will lose is many people in the West that actually have sympathy for the argument that Western powers shouldn't be mingling in that region. Many moderates in the West did not like the counter-reaction by China yesterday to also go after people that are not policymakers. So the fact that China not only sanctioned MEPs and foreign policy officials, but think tankers, researchers, I mean, that's not seen as a sign of confidence on the part of China to have an open debate. People are saying, look, if China is so convinced that the situation in Xinjiang is without any problem, why not allow free debate and free research?
Victor,
and why sanction
I want you to respond to what
researchers?
Peter just said. We sanctioned some MPs in the European Parliament, but also some research academics and experts.
No, I think the Chinese sanctions against these individuals and institutions are fully justified. Why? Because these are not just MPs or think tanks or scholars. These are people or institutions who and which have been spewing lies. They are not only fooling the Europeans, they are fooling mankind as a whole. They are distorting the facts. They are not doing their homework. They are not doing real research. They are not telling the truth to mankind. They are fabricating the facts. And they use these facts to accuse China and then to whip up all this frenziness in Europe. Because in European context, if some country has reason to accuse another country of genocide or crimes against humanity, I think European people will sign up to that. They will be opposed to that. But look at the realities in Xinjiang.
You think those experts and academicians are not just for open debate?
No.
They're worth the sanctionings that they're being
Absolutely. Punished. They deserve to be punished. Why? Because they fabricated the situation. They told lies to the European Parliament. They told lies to people at large, and they should be held accountable. They even, I would suppose, have legal liabilities. They may be brought to justice by Chinese courts. And I think mankind should see another day when their full malfunction and their irresponsibility will be exposed, and that will have legal consequences.
Zun, how do you look at the sanctions and the counter-sanctions between Europeans and Chinese? Where is this going?
Personally, I think that, of course, there's nothing wrong with what China has done. It is an appropriate response, and I think the sanctions, in my personal opinion, I feel like they're more symbolic. It is a way of saying that, you know, we can respond equally effectively, and we have the right to do that, to display that we are on an equal footing. We are potential partners, but if you're going to attack us, we also have the capability to respond in kind, and that is an appropriate response. I have another take on this as well. I think another issue to understand is that this is not just a conversation between China and the US or China and the EU. This is, in fact, a broader conversation. What China represents right now is, to a great extent, the sentiment of an increasing number of countries in the global south that have faced one-sided hostility, that have been, even if they have spoken out against certain treatments, certain policies, their voice has not been heard. So right now, even though, of course, broadly, we see that in global mainstream media, simply because there is a stronger voice, a system because of which a certain narrative gets more coverage, let's just say that. But that doesn't mean it represents the voices and the sentiments of a majority of the people. I'll give an example. In Afghanistan, for instance, when these reports came out that children were being killed by the troops that were supposed to fight terrorism, they said, we're not shocked, we know it's happening. We've always known that. So the point is, there's so many countries that know the hypocrisy. When China responds to the US saying that, look at your own track record, nobody stops and says that, oh, the US doesn't have this kind of a track record, or the EU and certain European countries have not been involved in grotesque human rights violations.
Especially considering the fact that those making the decisions on sanctions don't live the consequences.
It's a question of hypocrisy at the end of the day.
And Peter, about the timing, the sanctions are actually the EU's first against Beijing in decades, and it also came on the heels of the U.S. sanctions and President Biden's call for a stronger alliance with Europe against China and Russia. So is this a sign of the Europeans coming on board with the Americans against China and Russia?
Well, yes, it is. Now, in Europe, but actually also in the United States, but definitely in Europe, many people are a bit wary that some of the actions towards China are inspired by U.S. saber rattling, and they're not comfortable with that. Many people actually really want to trade with China, want to point out human rights problems. They may like to request that China signs up to pledges and enforceable pledges not to export goods that have been made by forced labor. But fundamentally, many of these people want to trade with China. And I think what happened with these Chinese counter-sanctions is that China has pushed the European consensus, so to speak, closer to the American consensus. And the American consensus is that something needs to be done, that like some sanctions like this are needed. Yes, so that's indeed the situation. So I'm not so sure how wise it was from the Chinese side to go so far. One example is that in the European sanctions, the EU did not go so far as to sanction the top official in Xinjiang.
Okay.
They only sanctioned four
so it is still a measured
officials.
policy rather than over-the-top policy, you think?
Well, I think I'm not a big fan of sanctions in general, but the good thing about these Magnitsky-style sanctions is that they do not hurt the Chinese people, right? Economic sanctions typically in the past have a very bad track record. So this new innovation is Magnitsky-style sanctions where actual policymakers are targeted. Ultimately, this is largely symbolic. So the idea is, look, Chinese sovereignty is respected, but if a policymaker has assets in Europe or wants to travel to Europe and has been seen to be implicated in what the EU considers
to be
everything
everything has to be looked at holistically. The context is that China and the EU just completed their negotiations on a major investment deal at the end of last year after 7 years of talks, and the parliaments still have to approve that, and national governments still have to approve that. Do you think what is happening now with the sanctions will change the momentum in there?
Well, I'm afraid so. Yesterday, the socialist group in the European Parliament came out saying, together with the liberal group, that they will now no longer support the investment deal with China, at least as long as MEPs themselves are on the Chinese sanction list. So I'm afraid the answer is yes. China is pushing the EU closer to the United States when it comes to its China policy.
Okay, Victor, I want you to respond to that. What will China do if Europe back off from the treaty?
Well, several points. One is that I hope Europeans or the Americans or anywhere else in the world, people need to know the real fact in today's world. That is, if you push China, China will push back. If you insult China, China will retaliate. China is not a force to be dismissed or to be humiliated. The Chinese nation are very much united, and we stand ready to defend the national interest of China.
But we also want to proceed with the investment treaty.
For example, if China retaliated against the Europeans first, and then Europeans imposed the sanctions in return, that's another matter.
So we are the reactive party.
China is the victim of all this. So don't claim to be an angel, because the Europeans this time, aided and abetted by the Americans, started this circle, and China was on the defensive side. That's number one. We, of course, want to sign the CAI with the European Union. Why? Because this is mutually beneficial.
Yeah.
It's not one-sided in favor of China. It's actually mutually benefit to the Europeans and the Chinese.
That's my question. Is it worth it to give away 7 years of efforts and a long and good promise of investment pictures for the sake of something?
Allow me to make one point. That is, if the CAI is to be ratified and put into effect, the Europeans and the Chinese will both benefit. So let's be realistic. Let's be very pragmatic. If anyone believes that cancelling or withholding the ratification of the CAI will hurt China without hurting the Europeans, that's indulging in fantasy. Now, on the other hand, purely from the Chinese perspective, there are national interests which China, the government and the people need to defend at whatever cost. So with or without that treaty at stake, China need to rise up to the occasion to defend the national interest. So don't mention that CAI at all. If you want to sign it, you are the beneficiary as well as the Chinese. If you don't want to sign it, then both of us are victims.
Zoom, what is your take? Do you think that the Chinese and the Europeans have the wisdom to compartmentalize and don't mix the two issues together?
I'll try to respond. Personally, I think I understand the pressure that elected governments face. So, for instance, of course, the EU countries and the EU at large knows that cooperation with China is beneficial in terms of the economy. It's long-term. They know China is rising. China and multipolarity is the future. However, that said, maybe the timing could be better for them. So now we know that with the Biden administration, they have a whole campaign to discredit and delegitimize China. At this point, as soon as the CAI was almost finalized, we saw how throughout on global social media there was this talk about why did the EU not bring up human rights? Why did the EU not bring up Xinjiang? And we see this happening all over the place through media, through social media, through influencers, etc. So maybe the EU understands that what if the backlash from people who are exposed to this, who may believe what's being said, and who have a mistrust against China, what if it backfires domestically against their politicians? This could be one thing. But the other thing is also, if I may, that China is not the one reacting. The truth is, the US is reacting. The US, the Biden administration, is reacting to the reality that China is becoming more influential simply by virtue of the fact that China is the country that held multilateralism, that was able to forge partnerships, great partnerships with their allies. And the mammoth task that the Biden administration has at hand right now is just to make sure that this is not the administration during which China crosses a great milestone that shows that China is almost even closer to being number one in the world, or that the US is not number one anymore. This is the pressure, and they will do whatever it takes to make sure this is not that administration, and that will be the same for the next one. So this pressure is inevitable, I think.
That's an interesting point. The US is the reactive party. Peter, I want you to take your measure on the next summit, the summit by the EU leaders later this week. Of course, Europe is still in the thick of the COVID response. There were resurgences. Economic recovery is still on the agenda. How much space will be devoted to China and the EU's response?
I think it will definitely come up, and EU leaders will, of course, back the approach that has been taken, certainly now. Indeed, it's true that this investment deal would make both China and Europe richer. It's a win-win. But on the other hand, consensus in Europe, or at least the democratic majority, is of the opinion that it's very important to go ahead with these very targeted sanctions, which indeed do not impose economic restrictions whatsoever, but which restrict the individual freedoms of Chinese officials in case they would come to Europe. So that's the path that has been chosen. If this ultimately ends in the non-signature of the EU-China investment deal, many people would find it unfortunate, but I think a democratic majority is of the opinion that it is worth it. Europeans are, so to speak, they prefer to be a little bit poorer as long as they can sort of have this rule of law in place. And they hope that China will understand that this is not meant to economically restrict China, but that's basically from the idea that in Europe we have rule of law. If somebody commits a crime, if somebody does something wrong, that does not stay without any consequence. So these Magnitsky-style sanctions are basically inspired by the idea that if then a Chinese official, or sometimes a Russian official, because they are also suffering these sanctions, would come to Europe, why should they be able to enter freely, while that is not the case for other instances of rights violations.
So this
that's
is
sort of
the
trade-off
basic,
that's
the
been
fundamental difference between China and the West. And the West think what China did in Xinjiang is a crime. But here in China, probably nobody thinks what the Xinjiang policy here in China is anything but guilty. Victor, if this kind of a value differences will stay there, what is the right way to address those different thinking and philosophies and values?
No, well, with regard to Xinjiang, I think the decisions by the European Parliament recently is completely inaccurate and completely misleading, and it's falsifying the realities on the ground. And I hope there will be a chance for the Europeans to wake up to the realities, to see what's happening in Xinjiang. Xinjiang today is safer, the Uyghur people are happier. Why? Because they are no longer subject to so much heavy dosage of extremism.
But probably,
and this is the very important
probably
thing.
the Americans and Europeans would never come to the pages this. But can we set aside the differences, or at least keep it at the minimum level?
Well, I hope so. I hope sanity will prevail. I hope we can really see a spade as a spade and deal with it as it is, rather than, for example, to have an escalation of tension spill over into many other areas and eventually making China as well as EU as a victim. And then the United States probably will be happier because it threw a wedge into China-European relations, and at a very little cost to the United States, and we both have been made a big victim.
Peter,
of this
I want your thoughts on this, the geopolitics aspect of this, because the foreign policy of America's new president is about rallying alliance, but EU is always been championing strategic autonomy, keeping a distance. Will this change everything?
Well, of course, it won't change everything overnight, but it's definitely a move that has brought the EU closer to the United States when it comes to its approach to China. Now, I think on the longer term, what's really needed is sort of a new understanding. It's true, China is a new global power, and that's a good thing. You know, China has economically developed enormously, and this has also been a great thing for the rest of the world, because we have also enjoyed the fact that China has become so much richer because
what is the major differences
so much
between Europeans and Americans on their China policy, value-wise and interest-wise?
I do think that in the United States you do have a section of the political class that also sees this as a new Cold War, and that's definitely not shared to the same degree in Europe. So I think in Europe, but also in Washington, but still also in Europe, people would like to avoid a new Cold War.
Okay.
They would like to have some kind of a new grand settlement, which sort of can make all sides happy.
All right, thank you very much, Peter, and thank you, Zun and Victor, for your insights. And you've been watching Dialogue here on CGTN. I'm Zoe in Beijing. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.